Hello and welcome. On 3rd September, GST Network has come up with an advisory, and this is about introducing a new functionality on the GST portal called Invoice Management System, IMS in short. This was much needed because if you're someone who had to deal with ITC mismatches, then at the end of this video, I'm sure you would agree that this IMS is going to be a game changer. In short, IMS helps in correction of invoices issued by suppliers so that buyers could avail correct input tax credit. Using IMS, buyers or recipients can communicate with suppliers, and this would help them in matching their purchase invoices with those issued by the suppliers. And IMS is going to be live on the GST portal from 1st October. Before we delve deep into knowing all about IMS, let's first understand why is IMS crucial. Before finding answer to our question why IMS, let's first understand the process of availing input tax credit. First, suppliers file GSTR1 by 11th or 13th of the subsequent month or quarter as applicable. Then the transaction would appear in GSTR2B of buyers by 14th of the subsequent month or quarter. After that, buyers file GSTR 3B by 20th of the subsequent month or 22nd or 24th of the subsequent quarter. If you would like to know more about GSTR 1, GSTR 3B, GSTR 2B, etc., I have separate videos on these topics. You may consider watching them. Links are in the description. Now coming back to GSTR 3B, most of the data in your GSTR 3B would be auto-populated. That is, outward supplies would be auto-populated from your own GSTR1. Then inward supplies would be auto-populated from GSTR2B, which is auto-generated on the basis of GSTR1 filed by your suppliers. This is how you avail input tax credit. Now, what if there is a mismatch in input tax credit between your books and GSTR2B? For instance, let's say you buy a computer for your business. As per the invoice, basic price is 1 lakh plus 18% GST, so total is 1.18 lakh. Later, when you download GSTR2B, you realize that even though the supplier has declared correct basic value, supplier has actually charged only 5% GST, so the total price is 1,05,000. Now, this is clear mismatch of ITC because of GST rate difference. And this ITC mismatch could be because of many other reasons. Say for instance, your supplier has not mentioned your GST, that is a B2B transaction is wrongly considered as a B2C transaction. Or if the supplier has mentioned wrong GST, so transaction would not appear in your GSTR2B. Or when an interstate transaction is reported as an intrastate transaction, when the value is incorrect, etc. So mismatch in ITC could be because of any of these reasons or more. And as of now, as buyers, we have no mechanism on the GST portal to correct such mismatches. So at the time of filing GSTR 3B, we end up losing ITC either partly or in full. Later on, we would be required to approach the suppliers for correction. This means a lot of delay and unnecessary blockage of working capital. So IMS is here to streamline this process. Now, how is this possible? Let's see how IMS works. Whenever you reach out to any supplier to buy anything, the supplier would issue you a tax invoice, whether or not e-invoice. Then the supplier would save this invoice, say in GSTR1. Once this is saved, this transaction would appear in your IMS dashboard, that is IMS dashboard of the buyer. Let me remind you, even though the supplier has just reported this invoice but not yet filed GSTR1, even then the transaction would appear in your IMS dashboard. Now, once this comes into your IMS dashboard, as a buyer, you have three options: accept, reject, or pending. Let's understand each of these options, starting with accept. If you agree with a particular transaction, you can choose this option. Once you do that, the transaction would move to ITC available section of your GSTR2B, which is then auto-populated into your GSTR3B. This is your eligible ITC. Then reject. Obviously, if you disagree with a particular transaction, you would choose this option. Once you do that, the transaction would move to ITC rejected section in your GSTR2B. And this transaction would not be auto-populated into your GSTR3B, so you will not be able to avail input tax credit. Here is the screenshot of accepted records. Then pending. If you are not sure about a particular transaction, then you can choose this option. This means you are going to keep this on hold on your IMS dashboard. So for the time being, this transaction would not appear in your GSTR 2B or GSTR 3B. Later on, when you are sure about this transaction, to avail input tax credit, you need to accept, otherwise reject it. But remember, to avail input tax credit, there is a deadline, and as of now, this deadline is 30th November from the end of the financial year. And also remember, whatever action that you take, the supplier would be able to see the option that you have chosen. Now the next question that would come to your mind would be, when do you have to take this action? You can do this after the supplier saves this invoice, but before you file your GSTR 3B. But by any chance, if you take this action after your GSTR 2B is generated, that is after 14th of the subsequent month, then before you file your GSTR 3B, you will have to recompute your GSTR 2B in your IMS dashboard so that correct ITC gets reflected in your GSTR 3B. This is how IMS is gonna function. Now let us talk about two key things that you need to remember. One, only after the suppliers file GSTR1, records would be auto-populated into your draft GSTR2B. To put it differently, at the time when your GSTR2B is generated, if a particular supplier has just saved invoice but not filed GSTR1, then such transactions would not appear in your GSTR2B, so you will not be able to avail input tax credit. Two, there is a concept called deemed acceptance. That is, if the buyer or recipient doesn't take any action, then such records would be deemed accepted and the transaction would move to your GSTR2B if the supplier has filed GSTR1, and you would be able to avail input tax credit as usual. But if you don't agree, then you will have to either choose reject or keep this transaction pending. Otherwise, the transaction would be deemed accepted. Let us now talk about amendments. Here we are going to discuss about two kinds of amendments. One, when the supplier amends saved invoices. In this situation, your IMS dashboard would reflect the amended invoice. So the original invoice would get replaced with the amended invoice irrespective of the action that you have taken. To understand this better, let's continue with our earlier example. Date of invoice of this purchase is 25th July 2024. And the supplier has saved this information on say 30th July 2024. Later on, the supplier has amended this transaction with correct rate of GST say on 5th August 2024. So your IMS dashboard would reflect this amended transaction. Now the second one, that is when the supplier amends invoice through GSTR 1A. Now what is this GSTR 1A? It is a mechanism to correct your GSTR 1 before you file your GSTR 3B. Even in this situation, the transaction would flow to your IMS dashboard, but your GSTR2B would be updated only in the subsequent month. To have a better understanding of this, let's consider the same example. That is, the supplier has saved this transaction on 30th July 2024 and the supplier has filed GSTR1 say on 10th August 2024. Later on, the supplier has amended this transaction through GSTR1A with the correct rate of GST, and let's say this amendment is done on 18th August 2024. This amended transaction would reflect in your IMS dashboard, but this transaction would appear in your GSTR2B only on 14th September 2024. So availing ITC would be deferred to that extent. To sum up, if you accept, reject, or if you don't take any action, that is deemed acceptance, such records would move out of this IMS dashboard after you file your GSTR 3B. So pending records would remain on your IMS dashboard, and if you want to close this by availing ITC, then the deadline is 30th November from the end of the financial year. While IMS is going to address this ITC mismatch problem to some extent, wherever there are ITC mismatches, buyers can either reject or keep such transactions as pending. To put it differently, buyers can't modify such transactions. So once it is live, let's start using and see if there are any practical challenges, and I'm sure GST network would bring in revisions wherever required. This was all about IMS. Hope it was informative. Thank you for watching.